There we go.
Tom Ricks, you're there.
How did that happen? We're finally
I
on.
don't know, but we're live now, and it's so great to have you.
It is nice to be here. Can you hear me through my mic?
Yeah, I hear you. You're a little muffled. I don't know if you can get any closer.
Okay.
Yeah, that's much better when you're closer.
Okay.
Up there on Deer Island in Maine. Listeners, thanks for hanging with us there. We've got the great Tom Ricks with us today. His new book is First Principles, What America's Founders Learned from the Greeks and Romans, and how that shaped our country. You may have seen me say this before, but to those of you who were watching last week, as I came with news of COVID in the house and my wife's positive test and our lockdown here and all those many days and nights of leaving food at the door, thank you for all your well wishes over this last week. Over this weekend, we've all tested negative. She's out of lockdown, thank God, and we are back in business here. It's wonderful to talk today with the great Thomas E. Ricks, Pulitzer Prize winner, author, military historian. Most recent book was on Churchill and Orwell. He's out with a new book on how the ancient Greeks and Romans and their examples shaped the thinking of our first four American presidents: George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. Tom Ricks, thanks very much for being with us from up in Maine. Great to see you, my friend.
You're welcome. It's good to be here.
So you say you freaked out in 2016 and wanted to know what the hell was going on when Donald Trump won the election.
I did. And it turns out a lot of other people kind of were asking similar questions because I've been told that my book will be number 4 on the New York Times bestseller list this coming Sunday.
That's amazing.
It did. It really surprised me. I wrote this book because I wanted to write it. I mean, the only good reason to write a book is because you have to. It turns out that a lot of other people are kind of asking the same fundamental questions is, you know, putting aside the personalities of today's politics, can we do better as a country? What are we supposed to be? How is this thing supposed to work? Can we amend it? Can we improve it? Are there things that the founders would look at today and be shocked by or approve of? And these were a lot of the questions I had on my mind that Wednesday morning after the presidential election of 2016. I'm in the house I'm in now. It was a gray morning. I woke up and I thought, what the hell happened here? I don't understand this election. I don't understand the support that Donald Trump got. I clearly need to go back to fundamentals. So I went down to my library and I took down Aristotle's Politics. And I reread it in the context of Trump being elected. The thing that leaped out at me from it was he says, look, there are several forms of government. There's monarchy, there is aristocracy, there is democracy. And one of the subsets of aristocracy is oligarchy, not ruled by the best, but ruled by the wealthiest. And Aristotle goes on to say that this is the least stable form of government. And I think that's illuminating looking back on the last 4 years of Donald Trump. We essentially had an oligarchy with trappings of democracy. We also had somebody who was fundamentally unaware of the constitutional rules. And so it's like we've all had a 4-year class in constitutional law in which the doors were locked. You couldn't leave even if you wanted to. And
the house was on fire.
Yeah, and it was kind of striking to watch Trump because there were 2 different areas for him. There were areas of norms, which he could stomp all over and did so quite happily.
Didn't give a damn.
Look at the norm that had been established of turning over power in an orderly fashion to your successor, whether or not he was from the political opposition. This is a tradition that goes back 250 years in this country. And Trump clearly is violating that norm. And I suspect we will see an era of reform in which some of the things that were norms will have to be written into law. Then there are the constitutional things. And this is where we really got our education. Where Trump really stubbed his toes was on the Constitution. He thought the Supreme Court worked for him, partly because he appointed so many of them. Mm-hmm. He thought even Nancy Pelosi kind of worked for him. He thought he'd been elected king and didn't seem to recognize that, no, these are actually co-equal branches of government in which James Madison brilliantly, with great foresight, had distributed power across the branches of the government between the states and the central government and really made it very difficult for someone to act like a king. So I come away thinking this Constitution of ours ticking along, was surprisingly resilient over the last 4 years, but there were some norms that we kind of accepted and treated as if they were part of the Constitution that got stomped all over. And we're going to have to figure out going forward how we fix that.
Tom, it does seem in the last 24, 48 hours, the weather has shifted again. It shifted toward Joe Biden and the future and the next presidency. He's naming his national security team. I want to talk with you about them later in our time. But there have been many times, and very recently, where a lot of well-intentioned and well-informed people have thought we are still deep in crisis, and Trump may still try and derail this thing. We've still got Michigan to bring it home and sort of put up its electors in line with the will of the people. Are you sure we're out of the woods here?
I feel like we are. I think we are. Partly because I think Trump's a bully, and bullies ultimately cave when they're confronted. And, well, you know, he'll mess things up over the next couple of months. He'll act in an un-American fashion. But I'm pretty confident that on Inauguration Day, he will be carted out and probably will be under indictment within 24 hours from the state of New York or the city of New York.
What do you take most vividly from the founders thinking about this? You remind us that we were far, far from a college-educated country in the days leading up to independence and after, in those years, a few thousand out of a few million. All right, that's just the way it was. But those few thousand played a very big role in shaping this country, and their thinking was deeply shaped by an education in the classics. Not George Washington as much. He was a kind of, he was your soldier leader more than scholar, but even he, steeped in this sort of, just in the atmosphere at the time. What was the call that the ancient Greeks and Romans had on the minds of these men who were so influential in shaping the country in the first place?
They didn't have a lot of examples to call on as they looked around. They knew they didn't want to be a monarchy, except for Alexander Hamilton. But they knew they didn't want to have a monarchy. And so if you don't want to be a monarchy, what are you going to have? They wanted to have a republic. And there are precious few examples of republics, and even fewer examples of sustained republics that were larger than city-states. So what are you going to do? Well, one of the things they really looked to was the Roman Republic, which they thought was the greatest political body ever seen. So the question for them is, how do we imitate the Romans? Well, first of all, you imitate the characteristics. And so for Washington, for many others, Cato, the Roman politician who opposed Julius Caesar, Cato becomes the model. He's frugal, he's prudent, he's a careful man, and a man deeply dedicated to his honor, who commits suicide rather than surrender to Caesar. George Washington aspires to be Cato, partly because that's how you become a public man in the America of the 18th century. You are seen as being unselfish, as totally dedicated to having the interests of the people and the public at heart. John Adams wanted to be Cicero, another one of the politicians who fought the decline of the Roman Republic, a great orator, but also a man of great vanity. And Adams managed to imitate both aspects of Cicero. Jefferson is always the odd man out. He's a little bit more of a Greek than a Roman, but he knows his Roman history too. And for these people, the decline of the Roman Republic becomes the central political narrative in world history. And for them, the decline of the Republic, ultimately Julius Caesar taking over as a kind of king, that to them is the urgency of front page news. How do we avoid the fate of the Roman Republic? How do we design a republic that's big and sustainable? Montesquieu, the great thinker of the Enlightenment, the French philosopher, Montesquieu has studied Roman history and says you can't have a big republic and it's hard to sustain them. So how do they deal with that? They decide the two things that really brought the republic down were corruption and faction. By corruption, they basically mean money in politics. And I think they'd be shocked today if they saw how money influences American politics, especially the role of corporations, the role of Wall Street. And faction to them meant partisanship, political parties. And so they come to see partisanship as near treason. And this is one reason why John Adams, when he is president, throws into jail a dozen newspaper editors simply for criticizing him. By the way, an echo of today's times in John Adams, our first one-term president, turned out of office, bitter about it, recognizes he's the first American president to be thrown out, yet nonetheless has a peaceful transfer of power to his opponent, Thomas Jefferson. Being John Adams, he's kind of surly about it. He makes a bunch of last-minute appointments to screw up Jefferson, and then he leaves town on the 4 a.m. coach to Baltimore and doesn't attend the inauguration. By the way, I'd be surprised if Donald Trump attends Biden's inauguration. I think that simply will be too much for him to handle psychologically.
It's hard for us to picture right now, hard for me to picture. Listen, here you're describing how it's amazing. They had to reach all the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans. It's a couple of thousand years, even from the time of our founding. Greeks for sure, and Romans nearly. And yet that's where they look. They had to go that far back to find democracy, republic. The elements of decline that you cite them fearing: corruption, faction, politicization, parties, oligarchy. We've got all these things going on right now. What's your, I mean, are we on the downhill slide here?
I don't think so necessarily. We have a very resilient Constitution, and we have we have James Madison to thank for a system that works. Madison would say, "Hey, gridlock is not a bug; it's a feature. I designed this thing so when you people can't agree, when you can't get along, when you're fighting with each other, things grind to a halt. That's a lot better than the minority imposing its will on the majority or engaging in violence or war." So Madison
do you still trust that, Tom? I mean, look at what's happening. What's happened? We have
I do.
Madison minority in the Republican Party that's counter-majoritarian, that's trying to cement that in. They've tried on the Supreme Court. They've tried at the local level with all kinds of gerrymandering, and you know the rest. And right now, as we speak, are actively resisting the clear winner in this contest. So there's a minority that doesn't seem utterly disempowered by our Constitution as we speak right now.
Well, there are two things are going on here. First, Madison dispersed power so greatly that you really do have to have coalitions, agreements, compromises, and deals, or nothing happens. At the same time, I think the founders, and Madison especially, would fault us on not amending the Constitution. They built this machine to be changed. That's why they're called amendments. That means they're bettering the machine. And they knew that you're going to have changes. They knew this in their own lifetimes. They saw the election of 1800 was very screwed up because they had kind of written the rules badly for a presidential election. The transition right now is a bit screwed up because they assumed that people would follow the example of people like George Washington and John Adams and transfer power without throwing a temper tantrum. So I think they would fault us and say, you guys need to make some changes there. And remember, it's easier to think about changes if you remember that these guys wrote this stuff sitting around hot afternoons in Philadelphia and eager to close shop for the day and go out for a beer. Should we have the Supreme Court handle impeachments or should we have the Congress? They decide, oh, let the Congress have it. At one point, they're arguing about should the presidency be one person, two people, or three people? And they look back to Roman history and say, you know, those triumvirates didn't work out real well. Let's go with one person. So one amendment I would think about is change the Supreme Court from life terms to terms of 14 or 18 years. Another possibility would be, okay, when they wrote the Constitution, the biggest state was Virginia, the smallest state was Delaware. Virginia was 12 times the size of Delaware, yet each state was given 2 votes. By the way, because that's the way the ancient Greek did it in their kind of confederation of states called the Amphictyonic League, if I get the name right.
Okay.
And Madison's, well, look, that league, kind of this Greek NATO, had 2 votes each, so we'll give the big and small states each 2 votes. The problem now is Wyoming is like 1/50th the size of California. And I think they would have said, well, then you've got to change it. move the allocations around. One thing, if you really wanted to have not a pure democracy, but a more representative democracy, have the big states have 3 senators, the middle third have 2 senators, and the smallest third have 1 senator. That would radically change the Congress and make it more responsive to the people, and it would more reflect our views. It would stop the minority from being able to stymie the majority. But I think the biggest thing the founders would say is, what the hell have you done with money in politics? This is pure corruption, letting corporations outweigh the people, letting the dollar outweigh the individual vote. That undermines democracy. And that's the reason Congress is asleep at the wheel. They had thought Congress would be the most active branch, the most energetic branch of the federal government. Instead, it just seems like it's half asleep and simply responsive to the executive.
So they built in stumbling blocks or gridlock, as you say. We've got urgent issues that need addressing, and that gridlock can be pretty damn frustrating sometimes. Ask the climate about that. And yet we've got listeners right now, Tom, who are watching and wondering if, where we are, is the Constitution enough at this point? It's been the norms that have buffered it have been so stripped away. Victoria's watching, and she says, I fear chaos has been unleashed and the mistrust will erode a functioning government while the population is already in a state of simmering unrest. I mean, the Romans failed. Despite all their self-awareness, they were proud of their republic and they lost it. They didn't have a constitution as detailed as ours. Nevertheless, they had a very deliberate republic and it slipped through their fingers.
It is, as Benjamin Franklin famously said, a republic if you can keep it. And I think it already has slipped to a surprising degree through our fingers. I don't think we have a democratic republic. I think we have an oligarchy with the trappings of democracy. I'm not a big fan of Bernie Sanders, but I do agree with him when he says that Congress doesn't regulate Wall Street regulates Congress. So I do think we have real problems, yet I think we have the means at hand to address them. For example, the Constitution has twice refers to common defense and general welfare. We talk a lot about common defense. I worked on the issue of common defense of national security for decades. Mm-hmm. We don't talk much about general welfare, the common good of especially things like the environment, education, transportation infrastructure, and most notably in the last year, health. All these things are public goods, common goods. Yet since the President Reagan was in office, we have not talked about the common good. We've not focused on it. We've made the market the king of everything. I don't think the market should be the king of everything. I don't think the market should determine whether someone lives or dies, for example. We're the only country that has this gigantic for-profit healthcare sector that doesn't deliver very effective healthcare. And over the last year, we've seen the federal government fail horribly when it came to the question of supporting the public health, the public good. So there are problems here. I think the founders, though, would point back at us and say, hey, dudes, we gave you the machine, but Americans stopped fixing it. In the first century or so, there were a lot of amendments to the Constitution, a lot of changes. In the last 50 years or so, there have been very few, and they tend to be trivial. I would love to see a constitutional convention that revisited a lot of these issues. And yeah, it will be loud, noisy, and violent. Americans tend to be loud, noisy, and violent. People were killed in the discussions in the states over ratification of the Constitution. There were real arguments. It's not going to be easy, but I think it can be done.
I mean, there's a sense of normalcy maybe reemerging right now. Donald Trump hasn't been talking much for a couple of weeks. The Biden campaign no longer.
Isn't it a relief?
Yeah, well, it is. It is. And the Biden transition group is announcing, who it's putting in power and in the different departments, and all this gives a sense that maybe we'll be back on track. On the other hand, despite the clear popular majority for Joe Biden, you had 70+ million Americans who voted for Donald Trump, and you see lots of them out, stomping their feet very publicly now, rattling their sabers, guns even. I mean, is there a...
I'm all for demonstrations. I don't like the brandishing of guns, even if it's legal, because it is a form of threatening violence.
So I guess the question is, how did they study the Romans and Greeks, the founders? Where was the moment where it began to slip away, when it wasn't, when you couldn't get it back anymore? Did they look back in history
for the Roman Republic?
For the Roman Republic.
I think it likely was when Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon and violated a norm.
Yes.
By bringing a Roman army onto the soil of the city of Rome.
Does it require the movement of troops to cross a Rubicon? You followed a lot of military history. President Trump, in the end, though he's put his own Secretary of Defense in there for this funny little rump period of his administration, but he failed in calling out regular troops over the summer in Black Lives Matter protest time. Are we secure as long as that's not happening, or can you cross a Rubicon without engaging the military in suppression or tyranny?
The U.S. military is, I think, almost uniquely aware of its professional obligations under the Constitution. I'd be very surprised to see the U.S. military engage in anything that violated the Constitution. Of course, I think the U.S. military did last summer violate the Constitution when National Guard helicopters were used to rotor wash demonstrators in the streets. It looked to me like Bull Connor's dogs and fire hoses in Birmingham in 1963. But I think the military at that point, the Army especially, recognized we got pulled into something here by Donald Trump. We need to be more careful. There's a real instructive lesson there. I think Trump will make trouble for the next 8 weeks. I do think we will have a peaceful transition of power, though.
You've written famously about Iraq. He's watching Iran. You've written about Afghanistan. We're talking troop withdrawals from Afghanistan. Does that make sense? What about the possibility of a very late-term Trump attack on Iran? Can you imagine that happening?
I can imagine it happening. It does worry me. This is where the Pentagon's great skill in slow rolling the White House will come into play. And they can slow roll with the best of them.
Mr. President, when Trump has his own Secretary of Defense, so to speak?
Yeah. Mr. President, don't tell us to launch XYZ. Tell us what you want to achieve. What's the strategy you want to implement here? Okay, Mr. President, then we'll do the force requirements for that, what that will entail. And then they come back and they say, okay, now the combatant commander has these questions and so on. And also, they are not going to obey illegal orders. They're going to obey a chain of command. Even in the Obama White House, you had calls like coming from, the White House, and a friend of mine who worked in the Pentagon told me about this. She said, I got a call saying the White House wants, and she says, first of all, buildings don't talk. What official wants? Okay, that official's not in the chain of command. You want something done here, I want it in writing, and I want to have a name on it from somebody in the chain of command. We don't just hop, skip, and jump because somebody in the White House thinks that would be a good idea. So there are ways of dealing with this, but as you say, as we've seen, Trump does violate norms, and a lot of things we think as part of the legal framework are really part of a framework of norms.
Does he need the U.S. military to attack Iran? Could he give a green light, even this late in his administration, to Israel to attack Natanz, their nuclear center there, and hand Joe Biden a fait accompli?
Israel doesn't need our green light. If they want to, they could. They have submarines out there in the Indian Ocean for exactly that sort of purpose. Don't forget, Israel attacked a Syrian nuclear facility just a few years ago, and many years ago attacked an Iraqi nuclear facility. I think it's interesting what's going on is this kind of quiet alliance that has emerged between Saudi Arabia and Israel. What that signals to me is they're probably talking about basing Israeli fighter jets and fighter bombers on Saudi soil for a possible attack on Iran, because it's difficult. It's a long way from Israel to Iran. It's a very short jump across the Gulf of Arabia, AKA the Persian Gulf, from Saudi soil to Iran.
Let me ask you then, this is the first time that a sitting Israeli prime minister has met the Saudi king, royal.
I wouldn't guarantee that.
Well, the first time that we know of.
The first time that there's been a public meeting that has been somewhat acknowledged, yeah.
All right. Could that be prep for something before January 20th? Could that be the kind of meeting that takes place when it's imminent?
Certainly they would like to think so, and certainly they'd like to show Trump that they're ready to do something. And it would be worrisome. If I were Iran, you know, I'd be very worried. As an American, I'm worried about it. We'll see. It is one area in which there's very little control that anyone in the US government has if Trump simply wants to give a green light to the Saudis and Israelis to carry out a raid.
What would a likely Iranian response be that Joe Biden would then face?
I have no idea. You know, never make predictions about the future or about the Mideast.
But Iran is not without capacity. We've seen that before.
Yeah, in a variety of capacities. Iran has been a maker of mischief around the Middle East. Essentially, what we've seen in the recent years is a proxy war going on between Shia Iran and Sunni Islam in various forms. And this has been going on in Yemen, to an extent in other parts of the region.
Put Trump in the Roman Greek terms that the founders might have looked at him. What figure comes to mind? Is this Caligula? Is this, it doesn't seem to have the competence of Julius Caesar. What kind of Roman character, or Greek if you like, is this?
Probably, it's funny, the founding fathers would have said Catiline, the kind of rich.
The great conspiracy against the Republic.
A rich guy who conspires against the Republic, really just indulges himself in immoral activities, doesn't care about anybody, totally lacking in empathy. And what they're shocked by is he kind of plans a takeover of Rome. And one of the things they're going to do is incite a slave rebellion and have everybody kill their masters and so on. And he just thinks this would be jolly fun. If there's any one Roman, though, that reminds me, it's the emperor. I don't know how to pronounce it quite. I've heard it and I keep on losing. I think it's Commodus, the son of Marcus Aurelius.
Okay.
Comes in actually in a wave of popularity. And after a few years, has just antagonized everyone. Really a lousy emperor. And I think finally they just get rid of him.
But who's everyone? Again, 74 million votes for Donald Trump, a Republican Party that remains almost in lockstep behind him. You've got some outliers now growing by a trickle every day. Nevertheless, everyone, this guy's got a lot of support, Tom.
He does. There's a lot of Americans out there who are unhappy and feel displaced, don't feel respected. I think this is partly economic and partly racial. The coast, the economies of the three coasts of the country are doing quite well. But the great interior, the vast interior that you know better than I do, is not doing well economically and feels kind of dissed by the big population states along the coast with booming economies. And I do think they need to be listened to. I do think the Democratic Party needs to adjust. And I think that people are also reacting to the fact that the rich are running this country and they want to give the rich the finger. And they're looking for a president who does that. However it happens, that more Americans are simply exhausted and want a normal, boring presidency. I think the accusations that Joe Biden was sleepy actually kind of helped Biden. A friend of mine said this morning to me that the choice of Anthony Blinken to be Secretary of State was hardly exciting. And I said, bingo. That's exactly.
Bingo, indeed.
I don't want to be excited by the Secretary of State. I don't want to have to worry about these people. I want to be quiet and low key.
As we speak, Michigan has certified the Biden win. So this thing is rolling forward now. That doesn't mean there couldn't be some grenade thrown into this by Trump in the time that remains. Scott is watching, listening, and asks, he says, almost all political discussion centers on the various dysfunctions of Congress, the presidency, the courts, etc. But is it possible that in a larger sense, and I wonder what the founders would have thought of this, in a larger sense, he asks, is it possible the American public itself has failed? Interpret that as you will, Tom, but where would you go with that?
My interpretation would be that the American public has failed frequently, and the founders failed frequently. It's not like we're not living up to them. These are the people who wrote slavery into the Constitution, remember. I mean, as a friend of mine said, slavery is not a stain on the American fabric. It is woven, threaded through the American fabric, and we are still pulling those threads out 240 years later. During the Revolution, John Adams later said, 1/3 of the American people supported the revolution, 1/3 were against it, and 1/3 were neutral. And that may be where we are now. It's the people who are not only supportive, but active and engaged. And I think it's partly the Democratic Party has failed to speak to these millions who voted for Trump and engage them. And somebody like James Webb, who should have been more of a voice in the party.
The former Navy Secretary.
Former Navy Secretary, and then Senator from Virginia. That the party seemed to have no place for him. Now they won Virginia without him, but you don't want to just write off millions and millions of Americans. On the other hand, I think, frankly, a lot of older white male Americans like you and me are unhappy because they no longer have the privilege of being in charge of the country, just simply by the virtue of their gender and the color of their skin.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people. Remember, it's only in our lifetimes that Black Americans have become first-class citizens. They were enslaved. They were enslaved
if they are even now. I mean, many would say, "Come on, there's still
exactly that they're slaves until the Civil War. They're second-class citizens by law until about the time you and I are born." And even now, there's a lot of people, especially older white male Americans and policemen, who don't believe that Blacks are first-class citizens with all the rights. So, look, the founders gave us aspirations, all men are created equal, that we fail to live up to. Yes, the American people frequently fail to live up to our aspirations, but they also gave us documents that said we, the people, are in charge of this country.
Here we are. I mean, I'm excited by the idea of the whole American population acting on the basis of this Constitution, which is not based, doesn't have to be based on race, on some ancient nation. It's conceptual, and it's an open and free concept. And I think that's great. I think the country could flourish with that, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't have resistance so fierce that it self-destructs. I mean, we've got people saying on here, look, you've got plenty of supporters who aren't disenfranchised in the middle or left behind by the economy in the middle of the country. You got plenty of rich guys who are supporting Donald Trump.
There are people who simply, and I know people, I have friends who say basically, look, I've got my money made. I don't want to pay big taxes on it. And I don't care about pretty much anything else. I like having a conservative Supreme Court that really focuses on property rights more than anything else. And I have the court I want, and I have the tax levels I want. I don't think the rich are paying their fair share in this country. And yeah, there's a lot of wealthy people who really don't care about much else except making sure that the tax man doesn't darken their door. These things can be amended. These things can be changed. But yeah, it will be a dynamic and sometimes brutal way to go forward. One thing I've been thinking about as we're talking here, in his first inaugural address, George Washington called America an experiment. The other day, I was reading an interview with Barack Obama, our second most recent president, who referred again to America as an experiment. He called it an experiment in whether you can have a multicultural, multi-ethnic democracy. So yeah, it is an American experiment, and we can still blow it. And so there are some days when, yeah, it does look like we're blowing it. There are other days when you say, this thing can work.
What will help us as we look to rebuild, to embrace a future that's really in line with our highest ideals and the actuality of who we are as a people, that multi-ethnic, what will help us from the ancient Greek and Roman legacy that these founders so embraced, and what might stand in our way? It comes down to us.
I think what stands in our way foremost is money in politics, campaign finance. it subverts the system and it makes the elected representatives less responsive to the people. I have taken refuge from the virus in the state of Maine, and the amount of money that poured in from out of state in the senatorial election was astonishing. I read somewhere that 94% of Susan Collins' campaign donations were from out of state. Mm-hmm. And in fact, she got more money from, I think, the area codes or the zip codes around Washington, D.C. than she did from Maine. That's not.
She was hanging by her fingernails and saved, if money does save a candidate, by piles of money from outside the state. It's not Republicans alone who get money from outside the state, but 94% is a lot.
That's not what the founders envisioned. I think the Supreme Court has, I think, more often than not, done damage to America. The Dred Scott decision that says in the 19th century that Black people, free or not, have no rights that the white man need respect. And I'm quoting.
Yeah.
Oh, you know, that was much harsher than the ancient world slavery in most cases. Sparta was harsh on its slaves, but generally in the ancient world, there was no racial aspect to slavery. Anybody of any color could be a slave. In fact, the word slave comes from Slavs that we would consider white people nowadays. Slaves had rights in the ancient world, and the offspring of slaves could hold public office. Black Americans really, except for a short period after the Civil War, could not hold office in this country until the 1950s and 60s and 70s. I think Andrew Young and Barbara Jordan were the first two members of Congress who were Black elected after 1901. I mean, Black people could not hold office. So our slavery was rougher and more pernicious than the ancient world slavery. We need to acknowledge our flaws if we're going to address them.
I'd like to have seen them addressed much more effectively during the time of Trump's administration. Your man, John Adams, they all paid attention to Cicero, but especially Adams.
Yeah.
And I wish you'd take us back to that story. Just let us savor it, think about it, of Catiline and this attempt to sort of blow up the Republic and take over, and Cicero standing up. And John Adams thought a lot about the series of addresses that Cicero made in the Roman Senate, and the way he went after a figure who you could think of as the Trump of his time. Correct me if I'm wrong.
You could.
What did Cicero say?
Cicero is stunning in the ferocity of his attack. He begins not slowly and carefully. He begins almost at the climax of his speech. How long, O Catiline, will you abuse Rome and the Roman system and so on?
How long shall thy madness outbrave our justice?
Yeah.
You quoted.
John Adams, he wants to be the American Cicero, and to an amazing degree, he succeeds. He's a great orator. He gets the ball rolling in revolution very early on. He's kind of a moron during the revolution. He thinks he knows about war for some reason. He doesn't. And he keeps on telling George Washington, your strategy's bad. Just make a big attack and let's get this thing over with, which was nuts and was not good advice. And then later, as I said, he was a lousy president, but he did turn over power peacefully to the opposition for the first time in American history. There's a saying that you don't have a democracy when you elect a president. You have a democracy when you elect a president who then turns over power to the opposition. And John Adams did that, and hats off to him for that. He did succeed in being that American Cicero. Remember, Cicero was seen as not only a great orator, but also a man of extraordinary vanity. Anthony Trollope, who wrote history as well as novels, said that he was wonderful when he talked about his country. The problem was he talked about himself just as much.
And there it was. Tom, think with us about who Joe Biden's bringing in right now. You know these names, you know these people. Jake Sullivan will be the National Security Advisor. Michelle Flournoy, first woman Secretary of Defense. Tony Blinken, of course, as Secretary of State. You've got Avril Haines, who will be Director of National Intelligence. Linda Thomas Greenfield, UN Ambassador. Go to Michelle Flournoy first. On the progressive left wing, she gets some incoming for her role in getting us involved in Libya and more. How How do you see her, and where is she likely to turn in the Defense Department?
Flournoy is the only one of this crowd that I actually know. I never really much liked the Biden crowd, partly because I just found Biden difficult.
In what way? That's interesting.
I had dinner with Biden when we were both in college together at Yale, and somebody asked one question and he talked for 45 minutes. Fast forward 20 years later, I'm a reporter in Washington. I'm doing an article, and my editor says, well, you got to interview Biden for this. So I trudge up to Capitol Hill, go to Biden's office. I ask him one question, he talks for an hour. And I have not one quote usable. He had verbal diarrhea.
So this is a journalist's lament. Is it a problem for a leader?
I think it is. I think it was. And what I've been struck by is very late in life. He's an old man.
Yeah. Very
late in life, he showed a real discipline on the campaign trail. He did not run his mouth. Mm-hmm. He was very careful in the debates to be precise and to contain himself. So somebody, I think, did sit him down.
But you said the Biden camp has given you some pause. And what do you mean?
Well, it's just because Biden also is a rather boring centrist. He just was not particularly interesting. I remember I was once assigned by the Post to do an article on John Kerry and his views on national security over the years. And I realized, whatever it was, John Kerry would find the exact midpoint of the Democratic Party's views mm-hmm. on national security. Mm-hmm. There was no sort of pattern of principles or interest. It was just, hey, I'm going to be right in the midpoint. And you saw the same thing in Biden. I got to say, though, boring is good. Midpoint centrism is fine by me. It is what the country, I think, needs and wants right now.
It's Michel just not Flournoy sort of famously said, I believe, that pushed the idea that the U.S. should, in the late 90s, be willing to use its military force unilaterally in the nation's interest. And then, we know what followed, the age of Iraq and more that you've written so much about.
Well, there's unilateral and unilateral, but Flournoy is very much an internationalist who will believe in NATO, who believes in NATO, in allies and alliances. I think she and the people around her were quite proud of how they handled Libya early on. Now, Libya has been besmirched by Benghazi, but a lot more Americans died in Iraq than died at Benghazi. And Congress never showed any interest in looking into a lot of those American deaths. Flournoy will be a solid, centrist, technocratic Secretary of Defense, who I think probably models herself on William Perry, seen by many inside the military and inside the civilian defense establishment as the best Secretary of Defense in recent decades. Technologically brilliant, a man of great precision, of thoughtfulness and care, and I think that's what Michelle will try to be. Two interesting things about her to throw out there. One, in high school, she was a very good volleyball player. Okay. And her father, I believe, was a bomber crewman in World War II.
Interesting. We'll learn more about Michelle Flournoy in the weeks ahead.
Went to Beverly Hills High, I believe.
Oh, okay. Okay. Coming up the hard way.
Well, I once asked her about it, and she said, we weren't wealthy, but my mother really wanted me to have a good education. We rented an apartment in like the one corner, corner of Beverly Hills. She said it was a little apartment, and that was specifically so I could go to Beverly Hills High.
What do you see, Tom? You've looked so deeply into the past after 2016. You look forward into this century. Do you see this working out, or do you see some kind of miasma of factionalism and racial division and American militias waltzing around and disillusion? Or do you see a great resurgence of maybe the kind of changes you're calling for to the Constitution itself to bring it up to date, or something just battling always in the middle?
If I have to stick my neck out and make the assessment and guess that you're asking for, I would say we are at the end of a 40-year-long love affair with the market that began with Ronald Reagan. Mm-hmm. During this time, we've seen a great privatization of assets. We have seen the wealthy withdraw from participation in society, basically the gated community approach to life, in which we've let the national infrastructure decay, in which we've let the public good be neglected and even forgotten. And I think it's time for this love affair with the market to end. And I think it may well be ending because it's not working for most Americans. It's working terrifically well for the top 1% of society who have pulled in all the gains in productivity in this country in the last 30 years. It's not working well for the middle class, and it's not working well for the poor. So I hope we are at that point where the love affair with the market, with Reaganism ends. And when people actually say, you know, government is not always the problem, sometimes government is the answer, especially in the last year, example, the coronavirus. There was no way to have a private sector response to that. It had to come from the public sector. It had to come from the federal government. Instead, what we've seen over the last year was it's as if we were suddenly had the Articles of Confederation government, that crazy government that preceded the Constitution, where basically the governors went around trying to do things and the central government hardly existed and didn't do anything.
How do we keep
basically
the oligarchs,
played golf.
How do we keep the oligarchs from burning it all down if they sense that market capitalism is being decentered?
I think the oligarchs respond well to people like FDR. I don't see Biden as an FDR. I see Biden as perhaps a bridge toward an era of reform.
The oligarchs hated FDR. What do you mean they respond well to that? They
were terrified of FDR, that awful man in the White House they used to talk about. But they realized that the alternative could be worse. And so they made their peace with FDR. They learned to live with that. And I think we do need to confront the oligarchy. And the only way to do that is to deal with campaign finance.
Well, I mean, good luck. You know, we've seen Charles Koch come out recently and say that a bunch of the things he's funded over the recent decades have been divisive ultimately. No kidding, Mr. Koch. But there's a lot more money out there that can fund a lot more mischief. We may have yet another disinformation network or two or three that emerge from the post-Trump period. Seems to me there are so many levers that money can pull now to resist the kind of changes that FDR made, to set the framework, the frame of reference around the challenges that we face. Ultimately,
if people recognize they're being manipulated by money, they do have the vote if they register and if they vote. And if we're going to get bailed out of this, it will be the vote that does it. There's a story that John Lewis told. He was one of the Freedom Riders in May of 1961, riding with great courage from Montgomery, Alabama into Jackson, Mississippi. And Alabama National Guard got on the bus with bayonets and basically said, we don't like that you're here, but we've been told we have to protect you. And then they arrive in Jackson, Mississippi, and all the Freedom Riders are hauled off to the Parchment Farm, the penitentiary slave system, basically slave labor farm. Years later, Congressman Sonny Montgomery of Mississippi says to John Lewis, you know, I was the officer from the National Guard that went on the bus when you were on that bus. And John Lewis says, well, you're not a lot nicer to me now. And Sonny Montgomery says, well, you didn't have the vote back then. There's a lesson there. The vote is incredibly powerful if it's used, and it can be detached from money if people are made conscious that they're being manipulated by money, by campaign finance, and so on. There are ways out of this, especially if you have a shift in the frame of reference that, hey, we have idolized CEOs and chairmen for most of yours and mine adult lives. The Lee Iacoccaism and stuff. The notion that somehow because people are rich, they should run things. And you get all these Silicon Valley moral idiots who think because they made a bundle somewhere in software that they should tell the rest of the country how to run. These are people who more frequently than not don't know anything except about one little corner of how to make money, and they were in the right place at the right time, and they were very lucky. We need to stop idolizing that. That's one reason I say we should start appreciating people who volunteer their time in ambulances and fire departments more than people who contribute money. All these rich people putting their names on public buildings because they contributed some bucks. I've heard that called billionaires graffiti. We wouldn't need public money to rebuild a skating rink in Central Park if the rich paid their goddamn taxes.
You wouldn't need private money to do it. Exactly.
Exactly. I mean, Donald Trump contributes all this money, gets his name slapped on it, and then pays $750 in income taxes. I mean, I don't think Trump is the problem, though. I think Trump is going to be behind bars, in not that long a time. But Trumpism, this sort of cynical demagoguery that really gets away from having a democratic republic, that will remain a problem. And I hope that we're up in for a shift in public opinion about this and a shift in who we value, who we idolize.
You've got a lot of never Trumpers in the Republican Party who haven't gone along with this, who themselves are saying the Republicans need to be voted out lock, stock, and barrel. And I hate to use that phrase right now with all the guns flying around, but do you see a shift in the actual party structure that it may not be Democrats and Republicans a half a dozen years
but
from now?
I've learned I am not a good political predictor. I thought that Biden would win in a landslide. And I was surprised when he didn't, and I was surprised that they didn't make much progress for the Democrats in the House.
Lost seats.
Yeah. So my thought, and people who know more about politics than I do, like Tim Noah, predicted that the Democrats would win in a landslide, and eventually the Republicans would basically dwindle down to a Whig party-like minority. And then the Democratic Party, as politics naturally evolve, would split into two. Mm-hmm. You'd have a left Democratic Party and a centrist Democratic Party, and they would begin fighting it out. If political power actually reflected people's views, that's where we would be at right now.
How can you say that when 74 million or whatever it is voted for Trump? That's a lot of political power.
Because more people voted for Biden, and because the Trump area of the country enjoys power in the U.S. Senate vastly out of proportion to the population. Yeah. You take all those states west of the Mississippi and north of Texas, that big red splotch, they have, 16 senators? They've got fewer people combined than California. Yeah. And I don't think that's right. That is not what the founders envisioned, this vastly out of whack representation in the U.S. Senate.
Was it gratifying, Tom? Americans themselves, you remind us, by the early 19th century, certainly by the time of Andrew Jackson, were no longer so interested in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. We've got a legacy of universities with architecture that reflects those ancient societies. We've got a national capital with the names, capital, Senate, that come right out of Rome.
Parties, the Democrat is a Greek word, Republican is a Latin word.
Yeah, all that. But Americans themselves have begun rejecting that, or beginning to ignore that ancient Roman and Greek history by, you name it, quite early in the 19th century.
Remarkably quickly, what happens is the Constitution basically says, yeah, the people are sovereign. Not partly sovereign, but they are sovereign. They own the country. And as soon as political power begins to flow to the people, these are not people who grew up reading Greek and Latin. These were farmers and people hacking a new life out of the frontier. And when they saw the opportunity for power, they took it to their credit. And they were not interested in all this classical nonsense that elites talked about. They were really interested in Mr. Market and getting their goods to market and getting their goods there faster, and getting their money back and having good hard currency. It was a rowdy, noisy country. And yeah, they threw out that classical stuff almost overnight.
So maybe that's where we still are. Maybe that's the same wave Ronald Reagan rode. Maybe that's the perpetual American future now, because the people are sovereign. The people are rowdy.
Sure, but I would say that America was more democratic in many ways then than it is now.
Mm-hmm. Exercise that power in a way that doesn't allow it to become concentrated in simply the hands of the few.
Yeah, and going out and voting. I mean, I'm not a big fan of Andrew Jackson, but boy, he's the first president elected from west of the Appalachians. He's the
Trump loves him. Trump puts him in the White House.
He's the first Western president. He's a racist. He's horrible to the Indians. I mean, or the Native Americans, they basically kicked them out of Georgia and Alabama,
Yeah.
where they'd held all that territory. But Jackson does represent that sort of rowdy, semi-educated, but determined to be equal to everybody else. And that's not a bad impulse in America. The sense that, look, I may be vulgar in your eyes, I may not have the education you think I should have, but I am every bit as equal as you. The problem is that was extended only to white Americans, and at that time to white male Americans. The problem is when those same people who express those views so vigorously don't want to see that basic equality extended to women or to minorities or to other groups.
Or you could say the problem may be that Donald Trump, who says, I love the poorly educated, could if he's not behind bars, you think perhaps he will be, could continue to work his demagoguery on that defiant part of the population who are well within their rights to see and believe what they like long after he's out of the White House, Tom.
Well, Eugene V. Debs ran for president from behind bars. So while he's unlike Trump in almost every other respect, there could be that parallel.
Gold-plated bars for Don.
This takes me back. Well, yeah, it'd actually be, just paint. Yeah. It takes me back to Jefferson's first inaugural. Here you have the first transfer of power in America to the opposition. Jefferson walks in and he says two things that are important. He says, first, look, not every disagreement over opinion is a disagreement of principle. Important to remember. And the second thing is he says, I'm not going to be throwing Federalist editors, the editors against me, in jail. He said, I let the public hear them. And if, as I believe, their views are wrong, the public will neglect them and not support them. If they're right, knock yourselves out, guys. But I think we're right. And Jefferson became quite powerful as a president, two very successful terms, even though not a big Jefferson fan.
Well, yeah,
I think that's
before social media and
newspapers were as disruptive then as social media is now. American political parties came into existence through the newspapers of the 1790s. Newspapers were booming. They were a new thing. You'd have shipping news and that sort of stuff, but newspapers written for the people were a new thing. And under Adams, you have 160 newspapers in America, of which 25 are bitterly critical of him. And he throws 12 of the editors into jail. Jefferson lets them out and says, okay, let's everybody knock yourselves out. Let's have these arguments and debates and discussions. And Americans really rallied to that. These newspapers were meant to be read aloud at street corners, in bars, and discussed. And they did. And that's what the American political party system grows out of. So yeah, we've had new media all the time. By the way, I think the shifts in information technology were far more disruptive in the 19th century than the 20th. The telegraph comes along and moves information instantly around the world. The internet is only a more colorful telegraph. Likewise, until the railroad comes along in the early 19th century, mid 19th century, the fastest that goods and people could move was as fast as a horse could go. You
described George Washington walking for a month back from the snowy Northlands to Virginia to take news of the war. This is when he's 21 years old.
And suddenly goods and people could move hundreds of miles overnight on a dependable basis by the railroad. So I think the changes in information technology were far greater in the 19th century than now. The social media stuff is just sort of buzzing out there at the edge of technology. It's not as revolutionary as it was in the 19th century.
Jail Trump or not? What's the lesson of the Roman and Greek republics when it comes to punishing out of office leaders who are found to have transgressed the law for the sake of the whole? Jail or not jail?
I think the Romans would have expected him to go back to his home and do the right thing, which is gently kill himself. We're not like the Romans, though. We are not Rome, as my friend Colin Murphy wrote a book about called Are We Rome? We are a country not of men, but of laws. And the president is subject to the law. And I think if he has violated the law, he should be prosecuted. In political terms, I don't think Biden will do that, but he will leave it to the states. And New York State, I think, probably has some good information against him that I think we'll find out about. What worries me is that murky area, though, in which Trump may have taken great loans from Russian oligarchs in the early 90s when he had declared bankruptcy a couple of times and American banks would no longer loan to him. And if he was unable to repay those loans, as I suspect he was, those would need to be reported in his income taxes as gifts. Mm-hmm. The question is, did he do that? If he didn't, then he committed fraud on his income tax returns. And that would be a federal offense. And that's the point at which a President Biden will have to say, do I pardon this? And the example of Gerald Ford pardoning Nixon will be held up to say, you should do this. The nice out for Biden will be, okay, let's get the information on the record. What happened here? Then you could commute the sentence rather than pardon him, but also let the states prosecute him on all his other various crimes.
For the sake of the republic, better to commute, pardon or commute, or better to let the law take him to imprisonment?
Well, it is made easier because you do have this alternative of the state going after him and his money and putting him behind bars. So they could have it both ways. Get the information out, commute, and let the states go to town.
Wow. Could be the American way.
Do you think Trump will attend Biden's inauguration?
I don't. But I'm not sure because, you know, there's another way in which he may want to stand up there and do that funny jaw-jutting thing that he does one more time with all the pageantry and Melania at his side in her sunglasses out.
And those weird military outfits she has. I don't get that.
Yeah, right. Sort of striding. I don't know how to call that. You know, for all we know, he could be in Cyprus before.
Do they not have an extradition treaty?
I'm not sure which country, but someplace, you know, where he takes his stagecoach out of town at 4 a.m.
Yep.
Maybe he'll be there. Tom, it's always great talking with you and wonderful to have it today. I'm so happy to see you in good shape and still bringing your perspective to all this and the lessons of history down to us.
Thanks very much. It's good to talk to you.
It's really great. The Tom Ricks, Pulitzer Prize winner, bestseller right now. His new book is First Principles, What America's Founders Learned from the Greeks and Romans and How They shaped the country. Tom, be well, stay well in this crazy time, and let's talk again on the other side of inauguration somewhere.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Good. Bye for now. Listeners, thanks for being with us. Thanks for all your good wishes around COVID in my house. We've escaped the quarantine time. We're all testing negative and in good shape. The hammer did not come down so hard with it, and I'm awfully glad for that. If you heard last week, you know my wife tested positive, and that was 2 weeks of serious lockdown around here. It's great to be out of it. Be well and stay well, and we'll talk again soon. Bye for now.